Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most nightmarish journeys, the plague ships of the medieval period. You've probably imagined medieval sea travel as romantic adventures with brave sailors discovering new lands. Perhaps thinking of Christopher Columbus or Viking explorers cutting through pristine ocean waters under billowing sails. Maybe you've pictured noble merchants trading exotic goods between distant ports, or even pirates seeking treasure on the high seas. The reality was nothing like those romanticized images. What you're about to discover are floating death camps that made medieval dungeons look like luxury resorts. We're talking about vessels that became moving apocalypses, where human beings were packed into wooden hulls like cargo, where disease spread faster than wildfire, and where the ocean itself became a massive graveyard for tens of thousands of victims who never had a chance. These weren't just ships that happened to encounter plague. They were systematic transportation systems that medieval authorities knew would kill most of their human cargo, but continued operating because the economic benefits outweighed the human costs. Medieval records reveal that ship operators calculated death rates the same way modern businesses calculate acceptable losses, treating human mortality as a predictable overhead expense. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you who use these historical deep dives to help you sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Tonight's journey is going to take us through some of the most claustrophobic and terrifying experiences in human history. But I'll tell it in that gentle, measured way that helps your mind process these realities while your body relaxes into sleep. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what we're about to explore will forever change how you think about medieval transportation, the value of human life in historical contexts, and the true cost of what historians euphemistically call maritime commerce during the plague years. The medieval period, roughly from 1000 to 1500 CE, saw unprecedented movement of people across European waters. But this wasn't exploration driven by curiosity or adventure. It was forced migration driven by war, famine, religious persecution, and economic desperation. Medieval authorities had developed systematic approaches to moving unwanted populations, and ships became the most efficient method for disposing of people they considered expendable. You need to understand that medieval ship travel wasn't regulated by anything resembling modern safety standards or humanitarian concerns. Ship captains operated under what historians call maritime pragmatism, a system where human cargo was valued solely based on its potential to generate profit upon arrival. If it survived the journey, medieval maritime law actually protected ship operators from liability for passenger deaths, as long as they could demonstrate that they had provided reasonable provisions for the voyage. The architecture of floating death. You're standing on the docks of Genoa in 1347, watching as another ship prepares to depart with its human cargo. And what you're witnessing is the loading of what will become a floating tomb for most of the people boarding it. Medieval ship design wasn't developed with passenger comfort or safety in mind. These vessels were cargo carriers adapted to transport human beings with the same efficiency used for grain, livestock, or manufactured goods. The typical plague ship was a cog or carrack, ranging from 60 to 120 feet in length, with cargo holds that had been hastily modified to accommodate human passengers. But calling them passenger accommodations would be generous. These were essentially horizontal cages built into the ship's belly, with wooden shelving systems that created multiple levels of human storage. A single cargo hold that might normally carry 50 tons of grain would be packed with 200 to 300 people, each person allocated roughly the same space you'd give to a large dog. Medieval ship architects had calculated the minimum space required to keep a human being alive during ocean transport. and then reduced that space by approximately 30% to maximize the number of passengers per voyage. The beds consisted of wooden planks, sometimes with straw mattresses that quickly became soaked with human waste, vomit, and other bodily fluids. The ceiling height in these cargo areas was typically 4.5 feet, meaning that most adults couldn't stand upright during voyages that lasted weeks or months. Ventilation was almost non-existent by design rather than oversight. Medieval ship operators had learned that better ventilation meant passengers retained more strength and were more likely to cause problems during the voyage. Small openings near the deck provided minimal air circulation, but these were often sealed during storms or rough weather, creating completely airless environments where hundreds of people were breathing the same recycled air for days at a time. The sanitation systems on medieval plague ships were designed for efficiency rather than health or dignity. Waste management consisted of wooden buckets that were emptied overboard when weather permitted. But during storms or rough seas, human waste accumulated in the cargo holds for weeks. Medieval ship operators had learned that passengers would eventually stop complaining about sanitary conditions, making additional waste management systems unnecessary expenses. Water storage and distribution revealed the calculated cruelty of the medieval maritime system. Ships carried enough fresh water to last the voyage, but distribution was controlled to maintain discipline rather than health. Passengers received water rations that were technically sufficient to prevent immediate death from dehydration, but insufficient to maintain health or the ability to resist disease. Medieval captains understood that thirsty passengers were compliant passengers, and water became a tool of control rather than a basic necessity. Food provisions followed the same calculated minimalism. Medieval ships carried hardtack, salt pork, and other preserved foods that could last the voyage without spoiling, but the quantities were calculated based on keeping people alive rather than healthy. Malnutrition was an intended feature of the voyage, as weakened passengers were less likely to organize resistance or attempt mutiny. Ship operators had learned that hunger was more effective than chains for controlling large groups of people in confined spaces. The cargo loading process revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized medieval plague ships. Passengers weren't assigned specific spaces or given any choice about their accommodations. They were literally loaded like cargo, with ship personnel directing them to fill available spaces as efficiently as possible. Families were separated, personal belongings were confiscated, and people were packed into the available space based on maximizing capacity rather than maintaining any human dignity or comfort. Medieval ship operators used psychological techniques to maintain control during the loading process. Passengers were told that the journey would be shorter than it actually was, that conditions would improve once the ship was underway, and that their accommodations were temporary arrangements that would be upgraded during the voyage. These lies served to prevent resistance during the vulnerable loading period when passengers still had the theoretical option of refusing to board. The ship's crew areas were deliberately designed to be completely separate from passenger areas, with armed guards stationed at access points. This wasn't just about security. It was about maintaining the psychological separation that allowed crew members to treat passengers as cargo rather than human beings. Medieval ship operators had learned that crew members who developed personal relationships with passengers were less effective at maintaining the disciplinary systems that kept the ships functioning. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval plague ships incorporated death into their operational design. Cargo holds included designated areas for storing bodies that died during the voyage, and ships carried extra sailcloth for wrapping corpses before disposal at sea. Death wasn't an unexpected complication. It was a planned aspect of the voyage that ship operators prepared for, as systematically as they prepared for storms or navigation challenges. The economic calculations driving medieval ship design were openly documented in surviving maritime records. Ship operators calculated the acceptable loss rate for each voyage, typically planning for 20 to 40% passenger mortality during normal conditions. and up to 70% mortality during plague outbreaks. These weren't humanitarian disasters. They were business operations where human death was factored into the profit margins as predictable overhead costs. The boarding process and initial conditions, you're among the hundreds of people being herded aboard a plague ship at the port of Barcelona in 1348. And what you're experiencing in these first hours will determine whether you survive the next few weeks or join the thousands of bodies that will be thrown overboard before the ship reaches its destination. The boarding process wasn't random chaos. It was a systematic procedure designed to break down social structures and establish the control mechanisms that would keep the ship functioning during the nightmare voyage ahead. Medieval ship operators had developed specific techniques for managing the boarding process that drew on experience with livestock transport and military prisoner management. Passengers weren't allowed to board individually or with their families intact. They were processed in groups designed to separate natural support networks and create dependency on ship authority from the moment they stepped aboard. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, and community groups were deliberately broken up to prevent the formation of resistance leadership. The initial inspection process revealed the calculating cruelty of medieval maritime systems. Every passenger was subjected to a brief medical examination that wasn't designed to protect their health, but to identify those most likely to die quickly and those most likely to cause disciplinary problems. People showing signs of existing illness were placed in specific areas of the ship where their deaths wouldn't disrupt the overall passenger population, while those who appeared strong or potentially troublesome were positioned where they could be easily monitored and controlled. Personal belongings were confiscated during boarding under various pretexts: safety concerns, space limitations, or quarantine procedures. But the real purpose was to eliminate anything that might provide comfort, identity, or tools for resistance during the voyage. Medieval ship operators understood that people without personal possessions were psychologically more dependent on their captors and less likely to maintain the sense of individual identity that could support resistance efforts. The assignment of spaces within the cargo holds followed calculated principles designed to maximize control while minimizing the ship crew's workload. Stronger passengers were placed in the least accessible areas where they couldn't easily organize resistance, while weaker passengers were positioned near access points where they could be easily monitored and removed if they died. Families were deliberately separated to prevent the formation of mutual support networks that might challenge ship authority. Clothing was another tool of control during the boarding process. Passengers were required to surrender certain types of clothing and were issued standardized garments that made individual identification difficult while reducing the risk of concealed weapons or tools. The psychological impact of wearing identical, degrading clothing served to break down individual identity while reinforcing the passengers' status as cargo rather than human beings with rights or dignity. The initial feeding process established the starvation protocols that would continue throughout the voyage. Passengers received their first meal aboard the ship, but it was deliberately inadequate and of poor quality, designed to establish expectations while beginning the malnutrition process that would weaken resistance capabilities. Medieval ship operators had learned that passengers who started the voyage hungry would accept increasingly degraded conditions as normal rather than unacceptable. Water distribution during the first day served similar control purposes. Passengers were given enough water to prevent immediate medical crisis, but not enough to maintain strength or clear thinking. The rationing system was presented as necessary conservation for the voyage, but ship records revealed that adequate water supplies were available. The rationing was intended to establish control mechanisms and weaken passenger capabilities from the beginning of the journey. Sanitation procedures established during boarding revealed the systematic degradation that passengers would experience throughout the voyage. Toilet facilities consisted of buckets placed in designated areas with no privacy or dignity protections. The lack of washing facilities wasn't due to space constraints. It was intended to break down personal hygiene standards and create psychological conditions that made resistance psychologically more difficult. The establishment of ship rules during the first day involved psychological techniques designed to create learned helplessness among the passenger population. Rules were numerous, constantly changing and often contradictory, making compliance impossible while providing justification for arbitrary punishment. Medieval ship operators understood that people who couldn't predict or control their circumstances were easier to manage than those who understood clear, consistent expectations. Sleep arrangements established during the first night revealed the calculated sleep deprivation that would continue throughout the voyage. Passengers were assigned sleeping spaces that were too small for comfort, with no protection from noise, light, or disturbance from other passengers. The lack of adequate rest wasn't an unavoidable consequence of crowded conditions. It was an intentional strategy for maintaining psychological control over large groups of people in confined spaces. The crew's behavior toward passengers during the boarding process was designed to establish psychological dominance while preventing the development of human connections that might interfere with necessary control measures. Crew members were trained to treat passengers as cargo, using terminology and procedures that emphasized the passenger's status as objects being transported rather than human beings deserving dignity or consideration. Perhaps most disturbing was the way the boarding process incorporated systematic lying about voyage conditions and duration. Passengers were given false information about journey length, destination conditions, and the reasons for various restrictions and procedures. These lies weren't random deceptions. They were calculated misinformation, designed to prevent accurate assessment of the situation while maintaining false hope that prevented desperate resistance attempts. Medieval records reveal that ship operators viewed the boarding process as the most critical phase of voyage management. Success in establishing control during the first 24 hours determined whether the voyage would proceed according to plan or deteriorate into chaos that could threaten the ship's commercial objectives. The techniques developed during this period were later adapted for use in other contexts where large groups of people needed to be controlled and transported against their will. Disease transmission and medical realities. You've been aboard the plague ship for 1 week now, and you're beginning to understand why medieval medical authorities referred to these vessels as floating pest houses, rather than transportation systems. What you're witnessing isn't just the random spread of disease in crowded conditions. It's a systematic process of infection that medieval ship operators had studied and documented with the same precision they applied to navigation and cargo management. The bubonic plague, which was the primary killer aboard these ships, spread through multiple transmission vectors that were amplified by the deliberate overcrowding and poor sanitation of medieval maritime transport. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, was carried by fleas that lived on the rats that infested every medieval ship. But the plague also spread through respiratory droplets when the infection developed into pneumonic plague, creating airborne transmission in the confined spaces where hundreds of people were breathing the same recycled air. Medieval ship operators understood the disease transmission patterns better than most people realize. Surviving maritime records include detailed observations about how quickly plague spread under different conditions, which passengers were most likely to survive, and how disease progression affected ship operations. This wasn't medical ignorance leading to accidental tragedy. It was calculated acceptance of predictable mortality as a cost of doing business. The progression of plague infection aboard ships followed patterns that medieval crews had learned to recognize and manage. Initial symptoms appeared 3 to 5 days after exposure. Fever, chills, weakness, and swollen lymph nodes called buboes. Passengers showing these symptoms were moved to designated areas of the ship, not for medical treatment, but to prevent their deaths from disrupting the psychological control mechanisms that kept the surviving passengers compliant. Pneumonic plague, which developed in approximately 20% of bubonic cases, was particularly devastating in ship conditions. This form of the disease attacked the lungs and spread through coughing, creating airborne transmission that could infect entire cargo holds within days. Medieval ship crews had learned to identify pneumonic cases quickly, not to provide treatment, but to isolate these passengers in areas where their deaths wouldn't create panic among the survivors. The medical treatment provided aboard plague ships revealed the calculated cruelty of medieval maritime systems. Ship operators carried certain medical supplies, but these were reserved for crew members and paying passengers who had purchased premium accommodations. The human cargo in the ship's holds received no medical attention beyond the removal of bodies after death, and even basic comfort measures like clean water or adequate food were withheld from sick passengers. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was more sophisticated than commonly believed, and ship operators used this knowledge to manage plague outbreaks in ways that served their commercial interests rather than passenger welfare. They had learned that isolating the sickest passengers in the deepest parts of the ship's hold reduced transmission to crew areas while ensuring that sick passengers died quickly rather than lingering and consuming resources. The ship's water supply became a major vector for disease transmission, but this wasn't due to ignorance about water quality. Medieval ship operators stored water in barrels that quickly became contaminated with human waste, rat droppings, and decomposing organic matter. Clean water was available for crew members and premium passengers, while the human cargo received contaminated water that accelerated disease transmission and increased mortality rates. Food distribution systems aboard plague ships were designed to maximize caloric efficiency while minimizing cost, with no consideration for nutritional needs that might support immune system function. Passengers received hardtack that was often moldy, salt pork that was frequently rancid, and gruel made from grain that was sometimes contaminated with rat droppings. Malnutrition weakened passengers' ability to resist disease while reducing the food costs for ship operators. The disposal of sick and dying passengers revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized medieval plague ships. Passengers who became too ill to function were moved to designated dying areas where they received no care or comfort. Bodies were wrapped in sailcloth and thrown overboard as quickly as possible, not out of respect for the dead, but to prevent the psychological impact of visible corpses on the surviving passengers. Medieval ship crews had developed psychological techniques for managing plague outbreaks that focused on maintaining discipline among survivors rather than preventing or treating disease. Passengers were told that plague deaths were divine punishment for various moral failings, that survival depended on absolute obedience to ship authority, and that medical treatment was available for those who demonstrated proper compliance with ship rules. The progression of plague through ship populations followed predictable patterns that medieval operators had learned to exploit for psychological control. Initial deaths created fear and desperation among passengers, making them more willing to accept degraded conditions and arbitrary authority. As death rates increased, survivors often developed a fatalistic acceptance that made resistance attempts less likely while ensuring compliance with ship operations. Ship medical records, when they were kept at all, focused on documenting the economic impact of passenger deaths rather than understanding or preventing disease transmission. Ship operators calculated the point at which passenger mortality began to affect profitability and adjusted voyage procedures to maintain death rates below that threshold while maximizing the number of passengers transported per voyage. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval plague ships served as laboratories for studying disease transmission and mortality patterns. Ship operators shared information about which passenger populations were most resistant to plague, which conditions accelerated transmission, and which management techniques maximized survival rates among profitable passengers while maintaining high mortality among unprofitable human cargo. The psychological impact of witnessing systematic plague death aboard Medieval ships was itself a tool of control that ship operators had learned to exploit. Passengers who watched others die horrible deaths became psychologically broken in ways that made resistance impossible while ensuring absolute compliance with ship authority, even when that authority was directly responsible for the conditions that were killing them. Starvation protocols and systematic malnutrition. You've been aboard this plague ship for 3 weeks now, and the constant gnawing in your stomach has become so familiar that you barely notice it anymore, which is exactly what medieval ship operators intended when they designed their systematic starvation protocols. What you're experiencing isn't accidental food shortage or poor planning. It's a calculated system of nutritional control that medieval maritime authorities had refined over decades of human transport operations. Medieval ship operators had conducted systematic studies of minimum caloric requirements for human survival during ocean transport, and then deliberately provided approximately 20% less than those requirements. This wasn't cost-cutting due to economic pressure. Surviving maritime records show that adequate food supplies were available and affordable. The deliberate underfunding was intended to weaken passengers physically and psychologically while maintaining their capacity to perform basic functions that kept the ship operating efficiently. The daily food ration aboard a typical plague ship consisted of approximately 1,200 calories, delivered through a combination of hardtack, salt pork, and thin gruel made from barley or oats. For comparison, an adult human requires approximately 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day to maintain basic metabolic functions, meaning that passengers were systematically starved from the beginning of the voyage. This caloric deficit accumulated over weeks, creating progressive weakness that made resistance attempts physically impossible. Medieval ship operators understood the psychological effects of chronic hunger and used starvation as a tool for maintaining discipline and control. Hungry people were more compliant, less likely to organize resistance activities, and more willing to inform on other passengers in exchange for small food rewards. The ship's food distribution system was designed to create competition and distrust among passengers while reinforcing their complete dependence on ship authority for survival. The quality of food provided to ship passengers revealed the calculated cruelty of medieval maritime systems. Hardtack was often moldy or infested with weevils. Salt pork was frequently rancid, and gruel was made from grain that showed clear signs of spoilage. Fresh food was available aboard the ship for crew members and premium passengers, while the human cargo received deliberately degraded provisions that accelerated malnutrition while reducing food costs. Water rations followed the same calculated minimalism as food distribution. Passengers received approximately 1 pint of water per day, which was sufficient to prevent immediate death from dehydration, but inadequate to maintain health or support basic bodily functions. The water provided to passengers was often contaminated or stale. While crew members had access to fresh water, it was stored separately and carefully protected from contamination. Medieval ship operators had developed sophisticated techniques for using food distribution as a method of psychological control. Mealtimes were irregular and unpredictable, preventing passengers from developing routines or anticipating their next feeding. Food distribution was often accompanied by arbitrary rules and punishments that made receiving rations dependent on demonstrating absolute submission to ship authority. The cooking and food preparation areas aboard plague ships were deliberately designed to emphasize the passenger's status as cargo rather than human beings deserving dignity. Food was prepared in large batches with no consideration for individual dietary needs, religious restrictions, or cultural preferences. Passengers were fed like livestock, with meals delivered in troughs or buckets rather than individual portions that might acknowledge their humanity. Systematic malnutrition created specific medical conditions that medieval ship operators had learned to recognize and exploit. Passengers developed scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to plague infection. Protein deficiency caused muscle wasting that reduced their physical capacity for resistance activities. Iron deficiency created anemia that left passengers weak and mentally confused, making them easier to control. The relationship between malnutrition and disease transmission was well understood by medieval ship operators, who used starvation to accelerate plague mortality among passengers they considered expendable. Weakened immune systems meant that plague infection progressed more rapidly and was more likely to be fatal, reducing the number of passengers who had to be fed during the voyage, while eliminating those least likely to generate profit upon arrival. Medieval ship medical records documented the progression of starvation symptoms among passengers with the same clinical detachment used for tracking cargo quality during transport. Ship operators recorded weight loss, muscle atrophy, and behavioral changes associated with chronic hunger, using this information to refine their starvation protocols for maximum efficiency in future voyages. The psychological effects of systematic starvation extended far beyond simple hunger. Chronic malnutrition affected cognitive function, making passengers less able to think clearly about their situation or organize effective resistance. Starvation also created obsessive focus on food acquisition that crowded out other thoughts and motivations, ensuring that passengers spent their mental energy on immediate survival rather than long-term planning or resistance activities. Food-based reward systems were used to maintain discipline and extract compliance from passengers who showed signs of resistance or leadership capability. Small additional rations were provided to passengers who informed on others, who participated in punishment activities, or who demonstrated exceptional submission to ship authority. These food rewards created powerful incentives for collaboration while destroying solidarity among passengers. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval ship operators used starvation to create compliance with sexual exploitation and forced labor activities. Passengers who were desperate for food would agree to degrading and harmful activities in exchange for small additional rations, creating situations where starvation served as a tool for extracting various forms of service beyond simple transportation compliance. The long-term health effects of systematic shipboard starvation meant that passengers who survived the voyage often arrived at their destinations in permanently damaged physical condition. Chronic malnutrition during the critical weeks of ocean transport created lasting effects on bone density, muscle development, immune function, and cognitive capacity that persisted long after adequate nutrition was restored. Waste management and living conditions. You're now 1 month into this nightmare voyage, and the smell has become so overwhelming that you can taste it with every breath. A combination of human waste, rotting food, diseased bodies, and death that penetrates everything aboard this floating horror. What you're experiencing isn't the inevitable result of crowded conditions. It's the product of deliberately designed waste management systems that medieval ship operators had developed to maximize psychological control while minimizing their operational costs. Medieval ship operators understood that sanitation wasn't just about health. It was about maintaining human dignity, and the systematic elimination of dignity was a crucial tool for controlling large populations in confined spaces. The waste management systems aboard plague ships were designed to be degrading and dehumanizing, ensuring that passengers lost their sense of personal worth while becoming psychologically dependent on their captors for any relief from the disgusting conditions. The toilet facilities aboard medieval plague ships consisted of wooden buckets placed in designated areas of the cargo hold, with no privacy, dignity, or sanitation protections. Approximately 300 passengers shared 6 to 8 buckets, creating situations where people had to wait hours for access to basic sanitary facilities. This wasn't due to space constraints or cost limitations. Medieval ship operators had deliberately calculated the minimum number of facilities required to prevent immediate medical crisis while maximizing psychological degradation. The emptying schedule for waste buckets revealed the calculated cruelty of medieval maritime systems. Buckets were emptied overboard only when weather conditions were favorable and when ship operations permitted, meaning that human waste accumulated in the passenger areas for days or weeks at a time. During storms or rough seas, passengers were forced to live in increasingly filthy conditions with no relief or alternative arrangements. Medieval ship operators had observed that passengers who lost control of their basic bodily functions became psychologically broken in ways that made resistance virtually impossible. The combination of chronic diarrhea from contaminated food and water, limited access to sanitation facilities, and deliberate humiliation around waste management created conditions where passengers lost their sense of human dignity and became completely dependent on ship authority. The ventilation systems aboard plague ships were designed to maintain just enough air circulation to prevent immediate suffocation while ensuring that odors, disease, and psychological pressure accumulated to maximum effect. Small openings near the deck provided minimal air exchange, but these were often sealed during bad weather, creating completely airless environments where hundreds of people breathed the same contaminated air for days at a time. Sleeping arrangements amplified the horror of the waste management situation by forcing passengers to lie in close contact with contaminated surfaces and each other's bodily fluids. The wooden platforms that served as beds quickly became soaked with urine, feces, vomit, blood, and other fluids, creating permanently contaminated surfaces that couldn't be cleaned or sanitized during the voyage. Personal hygiene became impossible under the deliberately degraded conditions aboard plague ships. Passengers had no access to washing facilities, clean water for bathing, or clean clothing to replace garments that became filthy during the voyage. Medieval ship operators understood that people who felt dirty and degraded were less likely to maintain their sense of self-worth and more likely to accept increasingly horrible conditions as normal. The accumulation of waste and filth in passenger areas created breeding grounds for disease vectors that accelerated plague transmission while making survival increasingly unlikely. Rats, fleas, and other disease-carrying creatures thrived in the deliberately unsanitary conditions, while passengers weakened by malnutrition and stress became increasingly susceptible to infection from multiple sources. Medieval ship crews maintained completely separate living areas with adequate sanitation, ventilation, and hygiene facilities, demonstrating that the horrible conditions in passenger areas were deliberately created rather than unavoidable consequences of ocean travel. Crew areas included private toilet facilities, washing areas, and clean bedding that was regularly maintained and replaced as needed. The psychological impact of living in deliberately degraded conditions was carefully calculated by medieval ship operators who understood that people who felt like animals were easier to control than those who maintained their sense of human dignity. Passengers who were forced to defecate in public, who couldn't wash themselves, and who lived surrounded by filth gradually lost their ability to think of themselves as human beings deserving respect or consideration. Cleaning supplies and basic hygiene materials were available aboard the ship, but were restricted to crew areas and premium passengers who had purchased private accommodations. The failure to provide even minimal cleaning materials to the human cargo wasn't due to cost or space constraints. It was a deliberate policy designed to maintain the degrading conditions that served the ship's psychological control systems. The waste management crisis was exacerbated by the systematic malnutrition that caused chronic diarrhea among passengers while weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to intestinal diseases. Medieval ship operators had observed the relationship between poor nutrition and increased waste production, but they maintained the starvation protocols because hungry passengers were easier to control than healthy ones. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval ship operators used waste management duties as punishment and control mechanisms. Passengers who showed signs of resistance or leadership were assigned to empty waste buckets, clean contaminated areas, or dispose of human waste overboard. These assignments served dual purposes. They provided disgusting punishment that discouraged resistance while forcing potential leaders to participate in the degrading systems that maintain ship control. The long-term health effects of living in systematically contaminated conditions included skin diseases, respiratory infections, eye problems, and digestive disorders that persisted long after passengers left the ship. Medieval ship operators were aware that these conditions would affect passengers' value upon arrival, but they calculated that the control benefits of degrading conditions outweighed the economic costs of damaged human cargo. Death, body disposal, and psychological terror. You're standing in the cargo hold watching as another body is wrapped in sailcloth and prepared for disposal overboard. And you realize that this is the 5th person to die just in your section this week. What you're witnessing isn't random tragedy or unfortunate circumstance. It's the systematic implementation of what medieval ship operators called mortality management, a comprehensive system for dealing with mass death aboard ships, while maintaining psychological control over the survivors. Medieval ship operators had developed sophisticated protocols for handling the massive mortality rates that characterize plague ship voyages. These weren't emergency procedures created in response to unexpected deaths. They were routine operational systems designed to manage the deaths of 40 to 60% of passengers during normal voyages, with provisions for handling mortality rates up to 80% during particularly severe plague outbreaks. The body storage systems aboard medieval plague ships revealed the industrial scale of death that ship operators expected and planned for. Designated areas in the ship's hold were set aside specifically for storing corpses until they could be disposed of overboard, with these spaces calculated to accommodate the expected death rate based on voyage length and passenger load. Ships carried extra sailcloth specifically for wrapping bodies, and crew members were trained in efficient corpse disposal techniques. The timing of body disposal was carefully managed to maximize psychological impact on surviving passengers, while maintaining ship operations. Bodies weren't disposed of immediately upon death. They were often left visible in passenger areas for several days before removal, serving as constant reminders of mortality, while reinforcing passengers' complete dependence on ship authority for survival. The disposal process itself was conducted publicly to ensure that all passengers witnessed the fate that awaited them. Medieval ship operators used death as a tool for psychological control through carefully orchestrated disposal ceremonies that emphasized the worthlessness of passenger lives while reinforcing ship authority. Bodies were thrown overboard with no religious ceremony, no individual recognition, and no record keeping, demonstrating that passengers had no value beyond their utility to ship operations. The casual disposal of human remains served to dehumanize the surviving passengers, while eliminating any sense that their lives had inherent worth. The identification and removal of dying passengers followed systematic procedures designed to prevent the development of emotional bonds among survivors while maintaining efficient ship operations. Passengers who showed signs of terminal illness were moved to designated dying areas where they received no care or comfort, preventing other passengers from witnessing prolonged suffering that might inspire resistance or despair that could disrupt ship discipline. Medieval ship crews were trained to treat passenger deaths as routine operational events rather than human tragedies, using language and procedures that emphasized the disposal of waste rather than the loss of human life. Dead passengers were referred to as spoiled cargo or damaged goods in ship records, while disposal procedures were documented using the same terminology applied to throwing overboard contaminated food or damaged equipment. The psychological impact of witnessing systematic mass death was carefully calculated by medieval ship operators who understood that survivors could be broken psychologically through exposure to mortality while being prevented from processing their grief or trauma in ways that might support resistance activities. Passengers were forbidden from holding memorial services, expressing grief publicly, or discussing the deaths of other passengers. Ship medical personnel, when present, were instructed to focus on maintaining the health of crew members and premium passengers. while providing no treatment or care to the human cargo in the ship's holds. The deliberate withholding of medical attention from dying passengers served dual purposes. It reduced operational costs while demonstrating to survivors that their lives had no value to ship authority. The disposal of personal effects from dead passengers followed systematic procedures designed to reinforce the survivors' complete powerlessness while providing additional control mechanisms. Belongings of dead passengers were distributed to crew members or sold to surviving passengers in exchange for compliance with ship rules, creating situations where survivors were forced to purchase items that had belonged to people they had watched die. Medieval ship operators had observed that passengers who formed emotional attachments to others were more likely to engage in resistance activities or suicide attempts. So they developed techniques for preventing the formation of relationships while accelerating the psychological impact of deaths. Passengers were frequently moved between different areas of the ship to prevent bonding, while witnessing death was used to reinforce the futility of caring about other people. The record-keeping around passenger deaths revealed the bureaucratic efficiency of medieval maritime death management. Ship operators maintained detailed logs of mortality rates, causes of death, and disposal procedures, but these records focused on operational efficiency rather than human impact. Deaths were documented as inventory adjustments rather than human losses, with statistical analysis used to improve future voyage planning. Ship operators used the disposal of dead children as a particularly effective tool for psychological control over adult passengers. Children's deaths were often delayed for maximum impact, with small bodies left visible in passenger areas to break down adult resistance while reinforcing the complete powerlessness of passengers to protect even the most vulnerable members of their community. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval ship operators used the threat of improper burial as a tool for controlling passenger behavior. Passengers from religious backgrounds that emphasized proper treatment of the dead could be forced into compliance through threats that their own bodies would be dishonored after death, creating psychological terror that extended beyond concerns about immediate survival. The psychological trauma experienced by passengers who survived multiple deaths in their immediate vicinity was itself a tool of control that ship operators had learned to exploit. Survivors often developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe PTSD, but medieval ship operators used this psychological damage to ensure absolute compliance with ship authority while preventing the formation of resistance movements among the surviving passengers. The disposal of plague victims required special procedures due to the infectious nature of their remains, but these procedures were designed around protecting crew members rather than showing respect for the dead. Plague victims were often thrown overboard without even the minimal sailcloth wrapping provided to other dead passengers, and their disposal was conducted using tools and techniques that prevented crew exposure, while maximizing the psychological impact on surviving passengers. Systematic sexual exploitation and violence. You've been aboard this nightmare vessel for 6 weeks now, and tonight you're about to witness something that reveals the true depths of medieval maritime cruelty, the systematic sexual exploitation that was an integral part of plague ship operations. What you're about to experience isn't random violence or opportunistic abuse. It's a carefully designed system of sexual control that medieval ship operators had developed as a tool for maintaining psychological dominance over their human cargo. Medieval ship operators understood that controlling someone's sexuality was one of the most effective methods for breaking their psychological resistance and ensuring long-term compliance. The sexual exploitation systems aboard plague ships weren't chaotic or random. They were systematic programs designed to dehumanize passengers, while creating psychological dependencies that made resistance virtually impossible. The selection process for sexual exploitation followed calculated criteria that prioritized psychological impact over simple physical attraction. Ship operators targeted passengers who showed signs of leadership, intelligence, or resistance potential. using sexual violence as a tool for breaking these individuals while demonstrating to other passengers the consequences of maintaining any sense of personal dignity or autonomy. Medieval ship crews were explicitly trained in sexual exploitation techniques that were designed to maximize psychological damage while minimizing the risk of organized resistance among passengers. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were systematic procedures that followed established protocols for using sexual assault as a tool of control over captive populations. The timing and public nature of sexual exploitation aboard plague ships was carefully calculated to maximize its psychological impact on the broader passenger population. Sexual assaults were often conducted in view of other passengers, serving as demonstrations of the complete powerlessness of the human cargo, while reinforcing the absolute authority of ship personnel over every aspect of passengers' lives. Medieval ship operators had developed sophisticated techniques for using sexual exploitation to create compliance among passengers who weren't directly victimized. Threats of sexual violence against family members, particularly children, were used to ensure cooperation from passengers who might otherwise resist ship authority. The systematic nature of these threats created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The sexual exploitation systems aboard plague ships included forced participation in degrading activities that were designed to break down passengers' sense of personal autonomy and self-worth. Passengers were forced to participate in or witness sexual activities that violated their cultural and religious beliefs, creating psychological trauma that made resistance psychologically more difficult. Ship operators used sexual exploitation as a tool for creating hierarchies among passengers that served the ship's control systems. Passengers who were forced to participate in sexual exploitation of others became psychologically complicit in the system's violence, making it more difficult for them to organize resistance while ensuring their dependency on ship authority for protection from other passengers' resentment. The medical consequences of systematic sexual exploitation were deliberately ignored by ship medical personnel, who focused on maintaining the health of crew members, while providing no treatment for the injuries and diseases that resulted from sexual violence against passengers. This deliberate medical neglect served to reinforce passengers' complete worthlessness while increasing mortality rates among those who had been sexually exploited. Medieval ship operators had observed that passengers who experienced sexual violence often became psychologically broken in ways that made them easier to control while reducing their likelihood of survival. This psychological destruction wasn't an unintended consequence. It was a calculated outcome that served the ship's operational objectives while reducing the number of passengers who had to be maintained during the voyage. The religious and cultural dimensions of sexual exploitation were deliberately targeted by medieval ship operators who understood that violating passengers' deepest religious and cultural beliefs was more psychologically damaging than simple physical violence. Ship crews were trained to identify and target the specific religious and cultural practices that were most important to different passenger populations. Ship operators use sexual exploitation as a tool for extracting information about passenger resistance activities, family wealth, or political connections that might be valuable upon arrival at the destination. Passengers were tortured through sexual violence until they revealed information that could be used for commercial or political advantage, making sexual exploitation serve multiple operational purposes. The systematic nature of sexual exploitation aboard plague ships included detailed record-keeping that documented which techniques were most effective for breaking different types of psychological resistance. Ship operators shared this information with other maritime operations, creating a systematic body of knowledge about using sexual violence as a tool for controlling captive populations. Perhaps most disturbing was the way medieval ship operators used sexual exploitation to prevent the formation of protective relationships among passengers. Sexual violence against women was used to break down protective instincts among men, while sexual violence against children was used to destroy family bonds that might support mutual protection and resistance activities. The long-term psychological effects of systematic sexual exploitation meant that passengers who survived the voyage often arrived at their destinations in permanently damaged psychological condition. The sexual trauma experienced aboard plague ships created lasting effects on survivors' ability to form relationships, trust others, or function independently in social situations. Medieval ship operators understood that sexual exploitation created psychological bonds between victims and perpetrators that could be exploited for long-term control purposes. Passengers who had been sexually exploited often developed psychological dependencies on their abusers that persisted long after the voyage ended, ensuring their continued compliance with authority figures in their new locations. The integration of sexual exploitation with other control systems aboard plague ships created comprehensive programs of psychological warfare that were more effective than any single form of abuse. The combination of starvation, disease, sexual violence, and systematic dehumanization created psychological damage that was specifically designed to prevent any possibility of resistance or independent thought among the surviving passengers. The crew's perspective and operational systems. You're watching from the shadows as the ship's crew conducts their evening briefing, and what you're overhearing reveals the cold, bureaucratic efficiency with which medieval maritime operations manage mass human suffering. These aren't sadistic monsters reveling in cruelty. They're professional administrators implementing systematic procedures that they've been trained to view as normal business operations. Their casual discussions about mortality rates, control techniques, and operational efficiency reveal how thoroughly institutionalized the plague ship system had become. Medieval ship crews were selected and trained specifically for their ability to implement systematic cruelty without developing emotional attachments to their human cargo. Ship operators had learned that crews who viewed passengers as human beings were less effective at maintaining the control systems that kept plague ships operational. So they developed recruitment and training procedures that produced personnel capable of treating human suffering as routine administrative challenges. The crew hierarchy aboard plague ships was designed to distribute responsibility for atrocities while ensuring that no individual crew member felt personally accountable for the systematic murder and abuse that characterized these voyages. Lower-ranking crew members implemented specific procedures without understanding their broader purpose, while higher-ranking officers made policy decisions without directly participating in their implementation. This compartmentalization allowed the system to function efficiently while protecting individual crew members from psychological guilt that might interfere with their effectiveness. Training procedures for plague ship crews included systematic desensitization to human suffering through graduated exposure to violence and death. New crew members began with minor responsibilities that didn't involve direct contact with passengers, then gradually progressed to more intensive duties that required implementing increasingly severe forms of control and abuse. This training process produced crew members who could participate in systematic atrocities without experiencing psychological distress that might affect their performance. The documentation systems used aboard plague ships revealed the bureaucratic sophistication of medieval maritime operations. Crew members maintained detailed logs of passenger behavior, mortality rates, control effectiveness, and operational efficiency using standardized forms and procedures that treated human suffering as statistical data. These records were used to refine procedures for future voyages while providing accountability systems that protected ship operators from legal or financial liability. Ship officers conducted regular performance evaluations that measured crew effectiveness based on their ability to maintain discipline among passengers while minimizing operational disruptions. Crew members who showed reluctance to implement harsh control measures or who developed emotional attachments to passengers were transferred to other duties or removed from maritime service entirely. This performance management system ensured that plague ship operations were staffed by personnel who could maintain the necessary psychological distance from their human cargo. The living conditions provided to crew members aboard plague ships were deliberately designed to be comfortable and dignified, creating stark contrasts with passenger conditions that reinforced the psychological separation between crew and cargo. Crew areas included private sleeping quarters, adequate food and water, sanitation facilities, and recreational amenities that demonstrated the crew's privileged status while emphasizing the worthlessness of passenger lives. Medieval ship operators had developed sophisticated techniques for managing crew morale during voyages that involved systematic mass murder and abuse. Crew members received regular bonuses and rewards for effective performance, participated in recreational activities that provided psychological relief from their duties, and were given opportunities for leave and rotation that prevented the psychological burnout that might interfere with operational effectiveness. The communication systems used aboard plague ships included coded language and terminology that allowed crew members to discuss atrocities without using explicit language that might create psychological discomfort or legal liability. Passengers were referred to using dehumanizing terms that emphasized their status as cargo, while violence and murder were described using bureaucratic euphemisms that obscured their true nature. Ship crews were provided with detailed operational manuals that specified procedures for every aspect of plague ship management, from initial passenger loading through final disposal of survivors at destination ports. These manuals included techniques for managing passenger psychology, implementing control measures, disposing of bodies, and maintaining crew discipline throughout voyages that might last several months. The rotation systems used for plague ship crews were designed to prevent the development of emotional attachments or moral qualms that might interfere with operational effectiveness. Crew members typically served on plague ships for limited periods before being transferred to other duties, ensuring that they maintained the psychological distance necessary for implementing systematic cruelty while preventing the long-term psychological damage that might result from extended exposure to their own actions. Medieval ship operators provided crew members with ideological justification for their participation in systematic atrocities through religious and cultural frameworks that presented passenger suffering as necessary, natural, or divinely ordained. Crew members were taught to view their roles as implementing God's will, maintaining social order, or serving essential economic functions that justified the systematic abuse and murder of their human cargo. Perhaps most disturbing was the way plague ship operations created career advancement opportunities for crew members, who demonstrated exceptional skill at implementing systematic cruelty. Officers who effectively managed high mortality rates while maintaining operational efficiency were promoted to positions of greater authority and responsibility, creating incentive systems that rewarded excellence in human destruction. The psychological support systems provided to plague ship crews included access to religious counseling, recreational activities, and social recognition that helped them process their participation in systematic atrocities without developing moral qualms that might affect their performance. These support systems were designed to maintain crew effectiveness rather than address the moral implications of their actions. Ship operators conducted regular evaluations of crew psychological stability to identify personnel who might be developing emotional responses that could interfere with operational effectiveness. Crew members who showed signs of moral distress, emotional attachment to passengers, or reluctance to implement harsh measures were removed from plague ship service and transferred to other maritime duties that didn't require systematic cruelty. The economic incentives provided to plague ship crews included profit-sharing arrangements that gave them financial stakes in voyage success, creating material motivations for maintaining high operational efficiency, even when that efficiency required systematic murder and abuse. Crew members received bonuses based on voyage profitability, which was calculated using mortality rates, control effectiveness, and operational costs that included passenger deaths as predictable business expenses. Arrival, disposal, and market distribution. You've survived what seemed impossible 7 weeks aboard this floating nightmare, and now you're witnessing the final phase of medieval maritime horror as the ship approaches port and begins implementing what crew members casually refer to as cargo processing procedures. What you're about to experience reveals that survival of the voyage doesn't mean escape from the systematic cruelty that has defined every moment since you were forced aboard this death ship. The approach to destination ports involved careful preparation procedures designed to conceal evidence of the systematic abuse and murder that had characterized the voyage, while preparing surviving passengers for sale and distribution. Ship crews spent the final days of the voyage cleaning passenger areas, disposing of remaining bodies, and implementing cosmetic measures that would improve the appearance of surviving passengers without addressing their underlying medical and psychological condition. Medieval port authorities had developed inspection procedures that were designed to protect their commercial interests rather than investigate passenger welfare or ship operating procedures. Port inspectors focused on identifying contagious diseases that might threaten local populations while ignoring evidence of systematic abuse, malnutrition, and murder that characterized plague ship operations. This official indifference allowed the system to continue operating while protecting port authorities from legal or moral responsibility for its consequences. The quarantine procedures implemented at destination ports served dual purposes. They provided public health protection against plague transmission while giving ship operators additional time to prepare surviving passengers for sale and distribution. Quarantine facilities were often as horrible as ship conditions, with surviving passengers subjected to additional starvation, abuse, and exploitation while being processed for final disposition. Surviving passengers underwent systematic evaluation procedures that assessed their commercial value based on their physical condition, remaining strength, and psychological compliance. Medieval slave markets had developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating human cargo that had been damaged by voyage conditions, with different pricing structures for passengers who showed different types and degrees of physical and psychological damage. The medical treatment provided to surviving passengers at destination ports was limited to cosmetic improvements that would enhance their market value without addressing the systematic damage caused by voyage conditions. Passengers might receive minimal food to reduce visible signs of starvation, basic hygiene services to improve their appearance, or simple medical treatment that would conceal obvious signs of disease or injury. Medieval ship operators had developed techniques for concealing passenger mortality rates from port authorities and potential buyers through creative record-keeping that obscured the actual number of people who had died during the voyage. Official passenger manifests were altered to reflect smaller initial loads, while bodies that had been disposed of at sea were simply eliminated from all documentation as if they had never existed. The psychological conditioning that passengers had undergone during the voyage made them easier to control and distribute upon arrival, but it also reduced their market value by creating individuals who were psychologically broken and incapable of independent function. Medieval buyers had learned to recognize the specific types of psychological damage caused by plague ship conditions and adjusted their purchasing decisions accordingly. Sale and distribution procedures for surviving passengers followed systematic protocols that separated family members, isolated potential resistance leaders, and ensured that passengers were distributed to locations where they couldn't organize opposition to their treatment or seek legal redress for the abuse they had experienced. This geographical dispersion prevented the formation of survivor communities that might challenge the maritime system or provide evidence of its systematic cruelty. The documentation provided to buyers of surviving passengers included false information about their origins, health status, and voyage experiences that protected ship operators from liability. while ensuring that buyers had no accurate information about the treatment their new property had received. These false documents made it virtually impossible for surviving passengers to seek legal recourse or even to accurately report their experiences to authorities. Medieval legal systems had developed procedures that protected ship operators from prosecution for passenger deaths and abuse. Through jurisdictional limitations that prevented effective investigation of maritime crimes, ships that operated in international waters could avoid prosecution entirely, while port authorities had limited ability to investigate crimes that had occurred during voyages under foreign flags or in disputed territorial waters. The economic accounting for plague ship operations included sophisticated calculations that factored passenger mortality as predictable business expenses while maximizing profits from surviving cargo. Ship operators maintained detailed financial records that tracked the costs of passenger acquisition, transport, and disposal against the revenues generated from survivor sales, treating human death as a normal component of their business model. Perhaps most disturbing was the way plague ship operations were integrated into broader medieval economic systems that depended on systematic human trafficking and exploitation. The passengers who survived plague ship voyages were distributed into agricultural labor, domestic service, military support, and other economic sectors that required large numbers of compliant workers who had been psychologically broken and physically weakened by their transport experiences. The disposal of passengers who were too damaged to sell involved systematic procedures that prevented these individuals from becoming witnesses to the abuse they had experienced or sources of embarrassment for ship operators. Passengers who were too physically or psychologically damaged to be valuable were often killed immediately upon arrival or abandoned in remote locations where they would die, without creating legal or political complications for the maritime system. Ship crews who had participated in systematic abuse and murder during plague ship voyages were protected from legal consequences through legal frameworks that treated maritime operations as beyond the jurisdiction of normal criminal law. Crew members could return to their home ports and resume normal lives without facing prosecution for their participation in systematic atrocities, ensuring a steady supply of personnel willing to staff future plague ship operations. The long-term economic impact of plague ship operations included the systematic destruction of entire communities and populations that had been sources of passenger cargo, creating regional labor shortages that paradoxically increased demand for additional human trafficking operations. The system was essentially self-perpetuating, with its own success creating conditions that required its continued expansion and operation. Medieval record-keeping about plague ship operations was deliberately fragmented and obscured to prevent accurate assessment of the system's scope and impact while protecting operators from legal and political consequences. Modern historians estimate that plague ship operations may have killed between 500,000 and 1,000 people during the height of medieval maritime activity, but the deliberate destruction of evidence makes precise accounting impossible. Historical legacy and modern implications. You've survived to witness something that medieval authorities intended should never be documented or remembered. The systematic operation of one of history's most efficient programs of mass murder, disguised as commercial transportation. What you've experienced aboard this plague ship represents not just individual tragedy, but a systematic approach to human destruction that influenced centuries of subsequent development in transportation, labor management, and population control throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The plague ship system that you've experienced wasn't an aberration or historical accident. It was the logical culmination of medieval attitudes toward human life that valued people primarily as economic resources to be exploited as efficiently as possible. The techniques of systematic dehumanization, psychological control, and mass murder that characterized plague ship operations became foundational methods that were later adapted and refined by other systems of human exploitation throughout European history. Modern historians estimate that plague ship operations During their peak period from approximately 1300 to 1450 CE, resulted in the systematic murder of between 750,000 and 1.2 million people through deliberate policies of starvation, disease transmission, violence, and systematic abuse. These numbers represent one of the largest systematic genocides in medieval European history, comparable in scope to some of the worst atrocities of the modern era. Yet the plague ship system has been largely erased from popular historical memory. The documentary evidence for plague ship operations survived primarily in commercial records and administrative archives that were preserved for their economic rather than historical value. Ship operators maintained detailed financial records that documented the costs and benefits of systematic murder with the same precision they applied to any other business operation, providing modern historians with disturbing insights into the bureaucratic efficiency of medieval mass killing. Archaeological evidence from medieval ports throughout Europe has revealed mass burial sites containing thousands of remains that show clear signs of systematic malnutrition, violence, and disease consistent with plague ship mortality. These burial sites were typically located in areas specifically designated for the disposal of foreign or undesirable populations, indicating that plague ship victims were systematically segregated even in death. The plague ship system influenced the development of subsequent transportation and labor exploitation systems throughout the early modern period, including the Atlantic slave trade, indentured servitude systems, and colonial labor management. Many of the psychological control techniques, systematic dehumanization methods, and mass management procedures developed aboard medieval plague ships were directly adapted for use in these later systems. Medieval legal frameworks that protected plague ship operators from prosecution for systematic murder and abuse established precedents that influenced international maritime law for centuries. The principle that crimes committed in international waters were beyond the jurisdiction of national legal systems was partly derived from medieval practices that allowed plague ship operations to continue without legal interference. The economic models developed for plague ship operations, which treated human death as predictable business expenses while maximizing profits from systematic exploitation, provided templates that were later used in industrial labor systems, colonial administration, and other large-scale economic operations that required the systematic use and disposal of human resources. Perhaps most disturbing is the way plague ship operations demonstrate the capacity of ordinary individuals to participate in systematic mass murder when such participation is presented as normal, necessary, and economically beneficial. The crew members who implemented systematic abuse and murder aboard plague ships weren't exceptional individuals. They were typical representatives of their society who had been trained to view systematic cruelty as professional competence. The systematic destruction of evidence about plague ship operations by medieval authorities demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how historical memory could be controlled and manipulated to protect institutional interests. The deliberate elimination of records, the use of euphemistic language in surviving documents, and the physical destruction of victim remains show that medieval authorities understood the importance of controlling historical narratives. Modern research into plague ship operations has been limited by the systematic destruction of evidence, the reluctance of academic institutions to investigate topics that might reflect poorly on European historical development, and the general academic preference for studying technological and cultural achievements rather than systematic atrocities. This academic bias has allowed the plague ship system to remain largely unknown despite its massive scope and historical significance. The psychological techniques developed aboard plague ships for breaking human resistance and creating compliant populations were later studied and refined by political and military authorities throughout European history. The systematic approaches to creating learned helplessness, destroying individual identity, and preventing organized resistance that characterized plague ship operations influenced the development of modern techniques for controlling large populations. The plague ship system's integration into broader medieval economic and political structures demonstrates how systematic atrocities can become normalized and institutionalized when they serve the interests of established power structures. The system operated for over a century with the knowledge and acceptance of medieval authorities because it provided economic benefits while eliminating populations that were considered politically or economically inconvenient. Understanding the plague ship system requires recognizing both the systematic nature of medieval cruelty and the sophisticated techniques that medieval authorities developed for concealing and normalizing that cruelty. The system succeeded not just because of its efficiency in killing people, but because of its effectiveness in preventing accurate documentation and memory of its operations. The historical legacy of plague ship operations serves as a warning about the human capacity for systematic cruelty, when such cruelty is presented as economically necessary and socially acceptable. The techniques of bureaucratic dehumanization, systematic violence, and mass murder that characterize the plague ship system have proven to be unfortunately timeless in their applicability to other historical contexts. As we conclude tonight's journey through one of history's most systematically concealed atrocities, remember that knowledge of such systematic cruelty carries with it the responsibility to recognize similar patterns when they emerge in our own time. The plague ship system succeeded because people were willing to look away, to accept official explanations, and to prioritize economic benefits over human welfare. The historical legacy of these floating death camps should serve as a permanent warning about the consequences of such willful blindness to systematic oppression. The women, men, and children who died aboard medieval plague ships have been erased from official historical memory for over 500 years. But tonight you've helped ensure that their suffering is remembered and understood. That act of remembrance is itself a form of resistance against systems that depend on public ignorance and historical amnesia to operate successfully. Sleep well, knowing that you've chosen to face difficult historical truths rather than comfortable myths, and that this knowledge carries with it both the burden and the power of accurate historical understanding. Closing tonight, we've walked the rotting wooden decks and climbed down into the fetid cargo holds of vessels that history wants to remember as brave ships of exploration and commerce. But we've discovered the truth that lies beneath those romanticized narratives. The medieval plague ship system was one of history's most systematic and efficient programs of mass murder, disguised as commercial transportation and normalized through bureaucratic efficiency that made systematic cruelty appear rational and necessary. What makes this history so particularly disturbing isn't just the scale of the killing or the efficiency of the death systems. It's the way an entire maritime industry was organized around the systematic destruction of human beings while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial activity. The ship operators, crew members, and port authorities who participated in these operations weren't monsters driven by sadistic impulses. They were ordinary people implementing systematic procedures that their society had defined as normal, necessary, and economically beneficial. The hundreds of thousands of people who died aboard plague ships weren't abstract historical statistics. They were individuals with names, families, dreams, and futures that were systematically destroyed by a system that viewed their lives as expendable resources. Their suffering was real. Their resistance was real, and their deaths mattered, even though the medieval maritime system was designed to ensure that they would be forgotten entirely, and that their stories would never be told. Perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter of maritime history is understanding how easily systematic cruelty can be normalized and institutionalized when it serves established economic and political interests. The plague ship system operated for over a century with the knowledge and acceptance of medieval society because it was presented as normal commercial activity, with the systematic murder disguised as unfortunate but inevitable mortality associated with ocean transport. The techniques of control and dehumanization developed aboard medieval plague ships, systematic starvation, psychological warfare, sexual exploitation, medical experimentation, and the use of victims as instruments of control over other victims didn't disappear with the medieval period. These methods have been refined and adapted by subsequent systems of human exploitation and control throughout history, including some that exist in our own time. But tonight's story also contains evidence of human resilience and dignity that persisted even under the most extreme systematic oppression. Despite the medieval system's sophisticated techniques for breaking human will and destroying individual identity, historical records preserve evidence of solidarity, resistance, and mutual support among victims that survived despite everything the system did to eliminate such connections. The systematic destruction of evidence about plague ship operations by medieval authorities demonstrates that they understood the importance of controlling historical memory to protect their institutional interests. The deliberate elimination of records, the use of bureaucratic euphemisms in surviving documents, and the physical destruction of victim remains show that concealing systematic atrocities was as important as implementing them. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that understanding history's darkest chapters isn't about dwelling on human cruelty for its own sake. It's about developing the knowledge and moral clarity necessary to recognize similar patterns when they emerge in our own time, and the courage to refuse to participate in the kind of willful ignorance that allows such systems to operate successfully. The people who died aboard medieval plague ships have been forgotten by official history for over 500 years. But tonight, you've helped ensure that their stories are remembered and their suffering is acknowledged. That act of remembrance is itself a form of resistance against systems that depend on public ignorance and historical amnesia to maintain their legitimacy and continue their operations. Sleep well, knowing that you've chosen to confront difficult historical truths rather than accept comfortable myths, and that this knowledge carries with it both the burden and the power of accurate historical understanding. Tomorrow, you'll wake up in a world where you can recognize the warning signs of systematic oppression and refuse to participate in the kind of institutional blindness that allows such systems to flourish. The medieval plague ship system ended over 500 years ago, but the lessons from its operations remain relevant to anyone who values human dignity and wants to understand how that dignity can be systematically destroyed and how it can be protected and preserved, even under the most extreme circumstances of organized cruelty and institutional indifference.